Most of what passes for spirituality online right now is not spirituality. It is a sophisticated form of going back to sleep. You see it everywhere. Soft-spoken women with perfect lighting holding tiny bottles of oil, promising that one intentional breath and one drop of copaiba will, quote, shift your state, unquote. Emotional alchemy workshops that teach you to use fragrance as an ally so you never have to face the actual fire. They sell the idea that small, comfortable gestures produce profound transformation. Return to yourself by collapsing deeper into the almighty nervous system and calling it healing. This is not alchemy, it is sedation with better branding. Real alchemy has never been gentle in the way these people mean gentle. It does not begin with self-care. It begins with the willingness to put the entire unfinished self on the altar and stay there until something actually dies and something else is born. The marketplace version skips the death. It offers aromatic band-aids for people who still refuse to give their full effort, their full honesty, their full life force to the conditions they are in. One drop, one breath, back to sleep. The charge remains. The shadow stays disowned. The system keeps feeding. That is the first thing that has to be named clearly. The leading spiritual content online is organized around weakness framed as wisdom, collapse framed as sensitivity, avoidance of the solar principle framed as, quote, holding space, unquote. It is the same infantilization you see in the endless female reels, only dressed in sacred language and sold at a higher price point. The entire orientation is toward blocking out masculinity, light, testosterone, male energy, the very forces that would interrupt the immersion and demand real change. Now look at the deeper mechanism. The matrix, the archonic intelligence, the adversarial current that runs the physical density, call it what you want, does not primarily control through force. It controls through unpaid psychic debt. People will not put their actual heart and soul into the work of being here. They hold back. They are not fully honest. They do not give their best efforts in the places that cost them something real. Then the residual charge of that unfinished work becomes the hook. Guilt, shame, the sense that something is still owed. That charge is harvestable. That is louche. That is the food. Coerced projection is the primary extraction technology. Whatever is refused in the self is thrown outward onto the world, onto men, onto, quote, toxicity, unquote, onto systems, onto the past. The external sacrifice, the rant, the purity performance, the endless trauma narrative, the public condemnation looks intense. It generates emotion. It feels like work, but it is counterfeit. The real sacrifice was never made. The individual remains incomplete, therefore permeable, therefore usable. Jung saw the psychological side of this with precision. What is not made conscious returns as fate. In occult terms, the disowned shadow becomes a psychic line of association that higher or lower intelligences can plug into. The morphic field of unfinished people is sticky. Auras leak. The system does not need dramatic possession. It only needs people to keep refusing the full incarnation. The cultural form this takes right now is regression into the maternal field on a mass scale. Open any feed. The dominant visual language is soft faces, exaggerated expressions, scolding or soothing tones, cleavage, finger wags, makeup, the constant presentation of the female body and voice as both comfort and erotic charge, almost no sustained writing, almost no real threads of thought in the comments, just affect, just atmosphere. It is pre-verbal. It is designed to pull consciousness backward into a state before discrimination, before form, before the capacity to separate from the emotional ocean. This is not accidental content. It is a continuous induction. Newspeak operating at the level of the nervous system instead of vocabulary. Language is not merely simplified. The very capacity for sequential, accountable thought is being atrophied while people are told they are, quote, doing the work, unquote, by feeling more. And the necessary complement to this regression is the systematic programming against the masculine principle. A man walks into a room with presence and clarity, and many people feel an immediate drop in their system. Discomfort, resentment, the urge to pathologize him. They rarely stop to ask why the reaction is so consistent, so automatic. They have been trained to experience the solar force as toxic. But the solar is the light bringer. It is the principle that interrupts immersion. It says, "This feeling is not the whole of reality. This story has structure and it has holes. This loop is not sacred. You are not a child." Without that interruption, there is only drowning. Most of the culture is currently drowning and calling it depth. The emotional body, the lunar field, the anima, the world of feeling and relatedness, none of this is the enemy. The enemy is remaining fused with it. The masculine principle is what makes conscious relationship possible. It creates the separation first so that love can actually occur instead of merger and resentment. When that principle is rejected at the cultural level, people do not become more loving. They become more flooded, more mentally ill, more addicted to the sound of their own unresolved pain, and more hostile to anyone who will not join them in the water. This is why so many trauma narratives never resolve. Resolution would require the solar function, structure, boundary, the willingness to stop feeding the story, the capacity to metabolize rather than recirculate. Instead, the loop is defended as identity. Any voice that points at the mechanism is experienced as the aggressor. Darkness is preferred because darkness does not demand the sacrifice of the unfinished self. Emotionality without conscious thought is the darkness itself. Vagueness, immersion, pure unconsciousness. The spiritual marketplace of oils and tiny rituals is simply the same pattern wearing better clothes. It soothes the almighty nervous system just enough to keep the person functional inside the incomplete state. It never requires the full offering. It never demands that the shadow be brought to the altar instead of projected. It never insists that the individual stop holding back their actual life force. So the charge remains. The harvest continues. And notice who benefits from all of this. Entire industries are built on keeping people circulating inside their unresolved emotions. They are financially and energetically invested in the loop, never completing. The vulnerable are the product. Many so-called healers project their own dysfunction onto their followers and feed on the dependency they create. Successful men in certain spaces feed on the insecure men who project power, completion, and authority onto them. It is a parasitic, predatory dynamic dressed up as help or aspiration. The last thing these structures want is for people to actually rise, integrate the shadow, stop leaking, and walk out of the field as whole. The way through has not changed. The physical world is dense and adversarial by design. The only bargain that produces gold is the one in which you give your whole soul to the conditions of incarnation without reservation. Sincere effort, radical honesty, the willingness to let the light enter the emotional body without drowning in it. That is the real alchemy. That is the chemical wedding. Everything else is proxy sacrifice, and proxy sacrifice keeps you food. You do not beat the system by sniffing oils and calling it a return to self. You beat it by becoming someone who no longer has unfinished business the system can feed on. That is the work. Everything else is going back to sleep with better packaging.